This lecture burst is on obedience. This is a longer topic, so I'm hoping to get through this within the 15 minutes I'm allotted with these podcasts. So we're going to go ahead and just start with what obedience is. Basically, behaving in a certain way because another person has directly told you or ordered you to do so. So it's a little different from compliance, where someone's asking you to comply with a direct request. You have the option of saying yes or no, agreeing or not agreeing. Obedience is someone telling you to do something. So think of it like a parent or an authority figure, a commanding officer, a teacher, a doctor, ordering you to behave in a certain way. So what we're going to take a look at is how authority figures get us to obey them. What types of tactics might be employed here, like we just talked about tactics for compliance, things like classical conditioning, modeling, operant conditioning, and following social norms all come into effect with obedience. Stanley Milgram was the big name to know here. You're going to be seeing and hearing a lot of him this week, especially with the videos that I've posted for you all. He stated that people comply to social pressures, but they do so depending upon how those social pressures are framed. And a lot of times when they're framed within an outright command, it really has an added effect on the person's behavior. So he set out to design a study that would investigate those effects of authority on obedience. So his famous behavioral study of obedience is what we'll be looking at. This is the subject of your extra reading for the week, article number 26, which is posted on Plato, where the study is his own. It describes the procedure of his experiment and the results of it. He set up a contraption like this that delivered fake shocks to a person. He had different roles that people played in the study, such as the learner getting strapped in here, and then the teacher, who was on the other side of a wall, giving out word pairs that the learner had to remember. Every time the learner got a word pair wrong, he would be fake shocked. The teacher thought the shocks were real. The learner is a Confederate and was playing along and acting like the shocks hurt each time. As the learner got answers wrong, the shocks would increase in intensity all the way up to the maximum shock value of 450 fake volts. So as you can imagine, this was sort of a huge study, has some ethical implications, which we'll talk about later. But according to Milgram, there are details of a situation that can powerfully influence people. And so what we're going to be looking at with his research is in what circumstances does obedience to authority show as being highest? Like what kinds of settings would a person have to be in for them to be more likely to obey an authority figure? What Milgram showed in his study is that the majority of subjects would shock the learner to the full amount. So when given commands to continue with the study, you need to continue, they would often follow along and do so. Many of the subjects tried to stop somewhere around here, which is where you see the dip in wanting to shock someone. Everyone was kind of okay with it at first because the shocks were low and not such a big deal. As the shocks increased right about here, and the learner would scream out like, "Ow, you're hurting me, this hurts." Here's where the conflict entered into the mind of the participant, the teacher, And here's where most people were like, I don't know if I should continue. I don't feel good about this. And then what happened is there was the experimenter sitting next to them in a white lab coat that said, oh, it's okay. Remember, the shocks don't hurt. They're just uncomfortable. This study really requires that you continue. We really need your participation. We don't want to have to throw out all our data. And they would give reasons that were coming from what was a perceived authority figure for why this person should continue. And then as you see, most did continue. Over 65% of people continued all the way to the end. Where the study took place mattered too. This was at Yale University, a very reputable institution that people highly regarded. The study has different results when it's done in a rundown experimental lab and when the person giving the orders is just another fellow participant rather than a perceived authority figure. We see it go down all the way to 20%. So the original Milgram findings were somewhere around 70% obedience. They went down if the setting wasn't as reputable, and then if the person wasn't an authority figure, they went way down. So I want you guys to watch the revised Milgram experiment done by Jerry Berger in 2007. A lot of people had criticisms of Milgram's original study, saying that it was done long ago, that people today wouldn't act that way, that not as many people would obey. The original Milgram study also only had men, it didn't have women. People argue that men and women would respond maybe differently, that might look different, gender effects. So Jerry Berger took on the task of revising the Milgram experiment and rerunning it. And that's what the video is about that I've posted on Plato. So you're going to want to read about the Milgram experiment first in the article. It's also talked about in the chapter. And then you're going to want to watch the video so that you can see the distinct differences between the original and the revised experiment. And I've put some little questions that go along with the video that are going to help you with that. Some lessons from the obedience studies. What did we learn by Milgram studies? In Milgram study, participants were pressured, right, to choose between following their standards and beliefs and then being responsive to others. They would hear others crying out on the other side of the wall. This would compel them to want to stop, yet they were torn between hearing the victim's pleas and also hearing the experimenter's orders to continue the experiment and not stop. What Milgram discovered are here some reasons why people obeyed. One was that it was a reputable institution where the study was taking place. It was a worthy study. The supposed victim was also volunteering, and he or she could leave at any time. And the person often felt obligated to finish the study because they already started it. Remember that reciprocity and commitment norm. Once somebody starts something, they want to be able to finish it. So they often felt like they had to finish even though they didn't want to. They were also assured that the shock would not cause any permanent damage. So they had this person, this authority figure sitting there saying, oh, I know it sounds bad, but remember, this isn't hurting them. They're fine. They're okay. And mainly because an authority figure was telling them it was okay, it divorced them from their own personal responsibility. And they felt like, well, okay, if anything happens to this person, then you're responsible, not me. So there was a lot of diffusion of responsibility, and people were okay with doing what they were doing as long as it wasn't, quote unquote, their own doing, as long as they could blame it on someone else and it wasn't their fault. People in this study also had no models of defiance. No one was defying, no one was going against the orders of the authority figure, so they didn't have that model to follow. And there was a lot of depersonalization going on. The learner was far removed. They were on the other side of the wall. They weren't seeing the face of the person they were hurting. They were hearing cries, but there was social distancing, right, between them and the learner, which allowed them to feel like it was okay. Think about this in the context of military commanders giving orders overseas. It's easy to give an order, something that's not close to you, and you're not seeing the effects of that order necessarily. How far can obedience go? So if we take the Milgram study and we go, well, what are the implications of this? We see it's far-reaching, especially historically, with situations like Hitler's regime, Saddam Hussein's regime, and even the Chinese military. A lot of these different social groups throughout history gain their power by getting people to buy into their ideals and conform to their values and the beliefs of the groups. Group members increasingly see group status as more important than individual need and desires. They want to be a part of these groups. And so there's often the same recruiting process for all people in the group so that they have then that common bond. And this relates a lot also to cults and the failure of critical thinking that happens within a cult-like mindset. The term cult literally means any group of people with a particular religious or philosophical set of beliefs and identity. But most people associate the term cult with a negative connotation. And so it could be seen as a group of people whose religious or philosophical beliefs and behavior are also so different from that of the mainstream that they're viewed with suspicion and seen as sort of existing on the fringes of what would be socially acceptable behavior, right? What we see happening in cults is that persons who are stressed, dependent, and unrealistically idealistic are perfect targets for recruits for cults. They buy right into the ideals of cults. They are often love bombed, surrounded with just all this overwhelming abundance of love that they feel so accepted and so loved on that they can't help but wanting to be a part. They make small commitments at first. Foot in the door technique works here with compliance. And then once they're in the cult, leaving is very difficult. Deprogramming is sometimes needed. 90% of people eventually do leave cults when they're a part of it, but then new recruits come in, so they always exist. But cults require you, by their very nature, to dissociate with anyone you know, to remove yourself from your family and your friends. In fact, that's what happened with the Heaven's Gate cult. This cult committed mass suicide. These people were swayed into committing suicide by the leader, and compliance factors played a really big role. I didn't put a video on Plato of this, but if you want, you're interested, you can look up Heaven's Gate cult on YouTube and you can find some videos. And just think about the compliance factors that were at play. Group cohesiveness was huge. So was similarity, unanimity, people making unanimous decisions together. There was a lot of de-individuation going on, like I'm not responsible for my actions, someone else is. They were complying with authority figures, namely the leader of the group, and they were making huge commitments. They all left their homes and their families to go out to this place and be a part of this cult, and they were cut off from the rest of society. Cults can be destructive in this way. And so we want to just make sure that we know that these are the implications of what can happen when obedience goes wrong, right? The destructive sort of effects of obedience, and how can that be resisted? We want to be reminded that there are types of characteristics that might compel a person to resist obedience. And so can we accurately predict who will and who will not obey? Maybe. When a person is held accountable for their own actions, they're less likely to obey. When they're reminded that blind obedience is no longer appropriate, that it's up to them to determine their actions, they're less likely to obey. When we see people questioning the motives of the authority figure, we know that they're less likely to obey. So people who resisted early in the Milgram study were more likely to be the ones who didn't go through to the end of the shocking value. And the closer you are to the target, the less likely you are to obey. So people who were sitting next to the learner were less likely to obey. And that concludes our obedience lecture.